In this video, we're going to go over the importance of end-to-end testing and how it can be set up in SOATest. The setup in front of you can be seen in most development shops. You would have a front-end website, which would be communicating with the web service client, which would be communicating with the back-end web server, and the web server would be communicating with the database. The idea here is that all of these different components will be built up separately. And you would test them separately, but when it all comes together, you would want to make sure that once they're integrated, they're working with each other as expected and is actually tested. So let's take them individually, one by one. So now let's go over how end-to-end testing could make sure this entire system is working well together. First, you would make sure that the web page is working correctly by testing that layer and making sure what's seen on the web page is correct and what is expected. You would also make sure that the web service client is communicating with the web server, and you would also want to validate that the web server is communicating with the database correctly and the response is as expected. The idea here is that in each of these layers, the data that's communicating back and forth is the same for each layer. So for example, if the web page sends back a response with an ID, that same ID should be communicating with the web service client and the web server, and the same ID should be updated in the database. In this scenario, everything is working correctly. Now where this really helps is when you're integrating multiple components together and one of these components fails, but you don't know where it's failing from. For example, if you test a web page, right, but something goes wrong, you see an error on your web page. Now you're communicating with multiple components, so you'd want to find out where this error is coming from. So now when you run your end-to-end test scenario, you can find out where the issue is. So for example, in this case, the web server communicating with the database, that layer is correct. Your database layer has been validated. But web service client communicating with the web server, that's where there's an error. So you can see that the web service layer validation has failed. So now from a developer or QA perspective, you know exactly that the error is between the web service client and the web server. So you can go ahead and resolve that issue. Okay, so let's go into SOATest and see how we can apply this. I'm going to walk you through the scenario that I want to test. I have a website called Parabank, which simulates a banking website. I'm going to log in and I'm going to request a loan. And I'm going to request a loan amount of 200 with a down payment of 50. And I hit apply now. You can see it creates a new account with number 13677. And if I click on it, you can see the balance is 200. My Parabank website also has multiple components. It has the front-end web page. It has a front-end web page. It has a web service layer, which is essentially requesting the loan. And it has a back-end database, which is saving information about each account number and the balance in it. So now what I want to do is validate that the web service layer is also giving the same information about account number 1367. And my database layer is also giving the same information about account number 13677. The idea here is that after requesting a loan from my web page, I validate that the account number has a balance of 200. Then on my web service layer, I'm going to validate that the balance is 200. And also on my database, I'm going to validate that the balance is 200. In SOATest, I've already set this up. You can see I have three different test suites here. The first one opens my web page and requests a loan and checks the balance at my web page layer. The second one checks it on the web service layer by sending a SOAP request to my server and checking the balance for that particular account number. And the third one does a SQL query to my database for that particular account number to make sure that the balance is also 200. So now let me run this entire scenario and I'll walk you through the response for each of them. First, I'm going to initialize my DB so that all the information gets reset. Next is going to open my page and go through the rest of loan. You can see it is requesting a loan. And now I'm going to check the balance. You can see the balance is 200. And let me go through the traffic for the web service layer. A request was sent for account ID 13566 and the response was 200. For the database tool, it was similar. A request was sent for account ID 13566 and the response was 200. And all of these values are being validated by the XML asserter. If you see some of our previous videos, it'll go over how to use the XML asserter. But what is set up here is that if the balance is not the same in each of these layers, it will give an error. And you can find out where it's failing. And for that particular layer, you can resolve the issue. And if your environment contains other components, you can add a test for a FTP service or a REST client also. And that is an example of how you would set up an end-to-end test in SOATest.